Hey there guys, in this video I'm going to be talking about superheroes, I'm going to be talking about supervillains. It'll be a fun discussion because it's more so on the line of why do we like these superheroes, why do we like these supervillains. I'm going to be talking about that today. I want to share some personal experiences of my own. And not necessarily whether superheroes are great or bad, whatever, you have your own opinions, but today I want to explore why I think we as humans are interested in these superheroes and their stories. So I want to start by just mentioning that, everybody has their own origin story, right? Everybody has this story that, they grow up with, and it's this narrative that we play out in our heads, right? And when we watch these superhero movies, shows, right, the villains, we can see this story play out for each of the superheroes or supervillains as they progress through their journey and become an actual superhero or supervillain. Now, for me, like looking back at those, it's interesting when I, as a viewer, am watching them because I'm realizing I'm interested equally in both the superhero and the supervillain story. I'm interested in how the supervillain became a supervillain. I'm interested in how the superhero became a superhero. And it's been weirder for me over the last, 5 or 6 years is that I'm actually more interested in some of the supervillains, mostly because, I feel like it's pretty cliche, it's pretty interesting, for a superhero, right? At some degree, about like how they got their powers, etc. But it's super interesting to know like how the corruption got involved with some of these villains, like, right, like the Joker, there's a ton of them, right? But yeah, like Bane, right? I was born in the dark or whatever his whole thing was. But it's interesting to me that how that works, and it's interesting how us as humans glob onto those stories because everybody has their own origin story, and what they perceive their narrative as, right? Like the Joker, he believes that he has this origin story that has created him to be a certain way, and I think all of us look back on our own narratives, on our own origin stories, and that can dictate how we think of ourselves as well, and who we are and how we portray ourselves. And it's so interesting. Not only that, and I'm sure this superhero, supervillain thing will come up in the future and future videos, but this specific one where we're talking about our own personal narratives is such a key thing in any type of therapy, work, or spiritual practices, or general life, like, career paths. I mean, the way that you twist and change your own narrative can really depend on how you look at yourself and how you see yourself. And a lot of this, thought for me is when I've noticed, myself going to therapy, like I mentioned. A lot of this has been super helpful in reflecting. I think a lot of people mention like, oh, the past is the past, it's this thing that just happened. We always look forward. And I think that's appropriate. I don't think that's like, there's anything necessarily inherently wrong with that. But it's interesting to see how we perceive ourselves through our path. I am this way because this is the way that I was raised, or I grew up this way, that's why I have to be this way. And so the way that we have seen our path, for instance, like, this is kind of interesting too. So like, I have talked to a fair amount of recovered addicts, just not necessarily looking at them as like the villain of the story, but just it's a very interesting path for someone who goes from it's always a tough journey, and they always have some scenario where they're realizing that they need some type of help, but they don't really necessarily feel like they get it, or they're in a tough situation where they turn to some pretty heavy drugs, and that continues them down this path of continual use and things like that. And then afterwards, there's this realization that, you know, I can be a different way as they look at themselves in a different light. There's a lot of things that come into play when they're in that recovery process, and it takes a fair amount of trial and error, typically. And I won't speak on that totally because I am not in that, you know, scene necessarily, but I can see that being the case in a minor way for myself. You know, for so long, I saw myself as just the baseball player, right? I saw myself as the guy who was going to make the bigs, make the major leagues. And that was who I was. And I put that identity on myself because other people had told me. I said to myself, you know, this is who you're going to be because of your path. You're going to be, you know, doing A, B, and C because this is the way you grew up and this is who you are. And it's interesting that as you get older, you realize, oh, there are certain pieces of that are helping me now, but I can be the one to frame that narrative. And for me, that's been the case for so long. Me reframing narratives over and over and over again to help me understand and to know myself better. And I think that journey of knowing thyself is really what this journey of superhero is like, what are my real superheroes or superpowers? It's like every year it feels like, okay, there are pieces and parts that are being added and subtracted. And it's like the fun of life is learning what the superhero, your superpowers are, right? And you think it's going to be one thing, like it's a fun thing to see, you know, Spider-Man find his powers, right? And I think that that's what we're doing on a continual basis, is learning and seeing what our superpowers are year over year, right? As we look back and, you know, we're starting a newer year, right? So I think about that. For me, it's like, okay, what have I noticed over time based on my narrative? How can I use some of these things in the past as separate occasions, separate events, not really attaching myself to them, but how can they progress me so that I can develop my own superpowers and not default back to a negative narrative from when it was a challenge? Because I think that's very normal thing to do, is when we default back to a negative mindset, we typically will also have these challenges or occurrences in our life where, oh, that happened to me, therefore I am this way, in a negative light. That's how you create your own supervillain story, is you see your own self in that negative light and you say, well, this is the way I am because of this. And you could go obviously both ways. And that's why I think it's important for us to make sure that our narratives are clear so that we can develop our superpowers in a healthy light. So that's what this video is about today. Superpowers, supervillains. I think to myself a lot, you know, what in my life am I really framing in a negative light? What pieces in my life do I still see myself as a supervillain? Am I playing a narrative back in my head that seems like I'm a supervillain? Just some thoughts for today, and that's what I'll leave you with. But I'm very lucky to be here. I'm very thankful to be in front of the camera, even though this creative process is a little funky for me sometimes. But I appreciate being here. Talk to you later.